Now, let's go to London to chat to Brendan O'Neill. Great to chat to you as always. Chief political writer at Spike. You must subscribe to Spike Online. Great reading every week there, or every day. Brendan, great to see you. We've had, you've got a great book out, which is all about October 7th. So I just quickly want to ask you, before we get on to the fact that the premiers here have all snubbed our monarch, what do you make about this news overnight that the Malaysian premier, Anwar, whatever his name is, has basically come out and condemned the killing of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas? What did you make of that? So basically, the Prime Minister of Malaysia is supporting Hamas, in effect. What do you make of it?
I mean, it's shocking, but not surprising. And you know what? He's not the only one. In London, we've seen people basically crying in the streets today because Sinwar was killed. And online, we're seeing leftists saying, you know, he was a great man and he fought to the bitter end, etc., etc. All this praise for a guy who was essentially a fascist. He was a modern-day Nazi who was driven by a violent hatred for Jews and who organized the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. You know, in my view, if anyone deserved to die in this 21st century, it was him. His death is a cause of celebration. I think it is good for Israelis and it is good for Palestinians who will have the boot of Hamas's tyranny slightly lifted off their neck. So I think anyone who's mourning his death, that's a red flag. That's the red flag to end red flags.
And that's Anwar Ibrahim, of course, the Prime Minister there of Malaysia. Rita?
Moving on to the US, I'm interested in your thoughts on that race and what it means, not just for America, but the West in general, and this philosophy we're seeing from the Democrats under Biden, arguably under Obama as well, and certainly would be followed under a Harris administration if she were to win.
If Kamala Harris wins, we are doomed. America is doomed. And the world is doomed. I don't think the world can survive 4 years of President Harris. I just don't think we'll make it through. You know, she is disastrous. She is, you know, people talk about Biden being on another planet. At least he has the excuse of being old and infirm. What's her excuse? You know, apart from the fact that she seems to drink a lot. But, you know, she often doesn't make sense. She rambles. It's incoherent. We don't quite know what she believes. She's incapable of explaining to us what her policies would be. I think it would be a disaster if she gets into the White House. And you know, the thing that everyone said about Trump when he ran for the second time, everyone said if he gets in a second time, the world will go to rack and ruin. In fact, the world went to rack and ruin under Biden. It was under the Democrats that war has exploded in Europe, in the Middle East. You know, under Trump, things were relatively settled. So under the Democrats, the world has gone in a bad direction, and I think it will get worse if Kamala Harris gets in.
James.
Well, Brendan, I mean, you said for a moment ago that that you didn't really know, nobody really knew what Kamala Harris was on about and what her policies are. But I would put to you that on three key issues, immigration and the regularization of illegals to create a new class of voter, on free speech, which she's already said she wants limits on, and on the Supreme Court, which is the big check on congressional and executive power, she would change all of those things. So I don't know, Brendan, I mean, what do you think about that? Because I feel like there's a real concrete program that's out there staring us in the face if only we care to look at it.
Yeah, when her policies do slip out, when they do kind of leak through all the nonsense that she speaks, it is terrifying, no question about that. She is awful on freedom of speech. She's not listening to the American people on the issue of immigration, on the issue of the border and people's desire for better control of the border. She's not listening to people on that. And also her identity politics is incredibly worrying. I can't believe that the other day she said that there is Russian interference in this election, that old chestnut, and that it's being targeted at black men. You know, here's a woman who claims to speak on behalf of ethnic minorities, essentially saying that black men are being brainwashed by Russians. call me old-fashioned, but that sounds a tad racist if you ask me. So that identity politics as well, that very divisive pork barrel politics in a modern form, that is also a destructive policy of hers, which I think will make America more divided. So what we do know of her policy is terrible. What we don't know is scary, because who knows what she'd do if she got into power.
Now, Brendan, I want to play you a bit of Sky News Britain. Not often we play them, but here you go. They were equally appalled as people here are about the fact that all our premiers from all our states refused to come along and meet the King and Queen. Here you go, have a listen.
There's a reception in Canberra for the King, and none of the political leaders of the 8 states and territories here are attending. Their no-show has been dubbed a royal snub.
I love the royal family. It's a personal thing. My grandma loved it, so yeah, it's awesome.
I think it's just outdated. I think it's a very classist and imperialist system.
I think it's fantastic. I'm glad that they are part of us, we're part of them. It is stable. I like that stability.
So, Brendan, the Poms have always been fascinated by how down under we treat the King and Queen. How's it been received in Britain?
People here are pretty shocked that all 6 premiers are not bothering to show up for this event in Canberra. It is not going down very well over here. And, even I'm a Republican. I am not a fan of the monarchy. I was a fan of Queen Elizabeth II. I thought she was a great person, not so much of Charles. But I do think that if you are a premier in a country in which Charles is the head of state, you should make an effort to go and attend this event. That is just good manners. Even I wouldn't snub the king if I'd been invited to meet him, and I'm a Republican through and through. So I do think it comes off very badly for these premiers that they are not bothering to do something that I think most Aussies, even some Republican Aussies, think is a good thing for them to have done. It really makes Australia look bad, I think.
And back in Britain, Brendan, Keir Starmer has removed, along with Margaret Thatcher and others, he's removed the portrait of Shakespeare. Now, he lost me at Thatcher. I was furious that he removed Thatcher, but Shakespeare? Give me a break, Brendan. What is going on with Keir Starmer? 100 days in office, how have they been?
Disastrous. This is the worst 100 days of a government ever. Complete disaster. They have been covered in sleaze. It's been a chaotic government. There have been riots. There's been the clampdown on the riots. There have been attacks on freedom of speech. They've backtracked on lots of their manifesto pledges. And now they are taking down portraits of some of the greatest Britons that ever lived from Downing Street. So Shakespeare's been taken down, Sir Walter Raleigh, Elizabeth I, Gladstone, Thatcher. I mean, the people who made this country. And when you have a government that is ashamed of the country that it governs, a government that looks with horror at the history of the nation that they are in charge of, that is really quite terrifying, actually. And it really, I think it points to a massive divide between the elites and ordinary people, where you have the elites having this shamefaced attitudes towards modern Britain and the history of Britain, whereas I think ordinary people take great pride in this country, great pride in people like Shakespeare, the most important writer that ever lived, and they think that pride should be shown in Downing Street as well.
James.
Well, this brings us back to something that we were talking about at the start of the conversation, and there's a dotted line connection, I think, between this and the lionization of Sinwar that we have seen on the streets and on social media. And I want to get your opinion on this because, for decades, for 100 years, we've seen the left lionize your Che's, your Castros, your Maos, and now your Arafats and your Sinwars. How much of this, was a guy like Sinwar, how much of that is anti-Semitism, but how much of that do you think is actually really because he represents standing up against the West in terms of this whole, decolonizing narrative that has so infected academia and many of our institutions?
That's exactly what it is. I think the anti-Israel psychosis that is gripping a lot of institutions in the West is really an extension of their anti-Westernism and even their anti-civilization, at their turn against civilization itself. We have a real problem in Europe of the Islamo left, this unholy alliance between radical Islamists and the modern day left. And it really came to a head over the Gaza issue and the Hamas issue and following the death of Sinwar. And I think what these two movements share in common, radical Islamists and the modern left, is just a burning, boiling contempt for the West itself, for the values of Western civilization, for the virtues of the Enlightenment. And it is that drive against modernity that brings these two forces together. And I think challenging them is such an important thing to do right now.
And Brendan, you've got your book out at the moment about October the 7th. We'll just put that up on the screen because that follows on from basically your thoughts on how October 7th has played out in the West. Just tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, so the book is essentially about all those things. It's about how the West failed the moral test of 7th of October, how instead of standing in solidarity with Israel and the victims of the pogrom, many people in the West took the side of the pogromists. They marched in tandem with Hamas. They took the side of the mass murderers. That's what we saw on our campuses, on our streets, in some of the newspapers. So I really just remind people of how that happened and try to explain why it happened. And I make the case for standing shoulder to shoulder with the Jewish state and standing up for Western values.
And Hamas knew that was going to happen because they knew doing what they did on October 7 was going to see an almighty response from Israel, that they could not match Israel, they were going to be decimated. And yet they knew that in the West there was going to be an uprising against Israel. How did they count on that? Because it took a lot of people in the West by surprise, but the Islamists knew it was there.
They knew how weak the West is,
Yeah.
Rita. Brendan.
Oh, absolutely. They were counting on it. They were counting on all these upper middle class twits going onto the streets and singing the praises of Hamas. They knew it was going to happen. And, you know, there's this gross symbiotic relationship now between Hamas and the Western left, because Hamas, the reason Hamas is letting this war drag on, even though it can never win, is because it knows that every dead Palestinian will be held up by these Western activists as proof of how evil Israel is. And in fact, Sinwar, shortly before he died, he said, we need more and more Palestinian martyrs because that will hurt Israel. So this is a movement that doesn't care about killing Israelis, as we know, doesn't even care about dead Palestinians, and in fact wants to give more dead Palestinians to these Western activists who march through the streets like idiots every weekend. So that relationship between Hamas's bloodthirstiness and the desire of these Western activists to demonstrate their virtue to the world through the issue of Palestine, that's a very intimate relationship now, and it's a very gross one as well.
Well, Brendan, always great to chat to you. I urge people to read your book. Here we go, there it is, After the Pogrom by Brendan O'Neill. So you can order that, please do. Great writer and a great thinker, and great to have you, as always, on Outsiders, Brendan. Thanks so much, and we'll chat soon.